They say cats have 9 lives. But tonight, this cat is gambling his last one to save a soul that everyone else has forgotten. In a building made of glass and greed, the only thing standing between a tragedy and a miracle is a shadow with claws. The Silent Observer. Midnight City was a forest of skyscrapers, a neon-lit jungle where the sun was often forgotten. Down on the streets, life was a blur of honking horns and rushing crowds, but up high, the air was different, thin, cold, and lonely. For most, the heights were a symbol of success, but for the creatures that lived in the shadows, it was a precarious maze of ledges and vents. Among these shadows lived Midnight, a sleek black stray with a notched ear and eyes the color of harvested honey. He didn't belong to a home, and he didn't seek the comfort of a lap. He was a survivor who had mastered the high path, the narrow concrete lips that skirted the 14th floors of the city's most expensive apartment blocks. He didn't hunt for mice in these luxury towers. There was no room for pests in buildings made of glass and steel. Instead, Midnight was a hunter of secrets. He watched through the floor-to-ceiling windows, seeing the private lives of people who thought they were invisible to the world. He saw tears, he saw arguments, and he saw the hollow silence of those who had everything but felt nothing. One particular apartment, 1402, had become his primary watch post. It was a place of cold marble and expensive art, owned by a man named Arthur. To the people on the street, Arthur was a titan of industry, but to Midnight, he was just a weary soul who spent his evenings staring at a flickering television until sleep finally claimed him in his lonely chair. Apartment 1402 felt more like a museum than a home. Every piece of furniture was perfectly placed, and every surface was polished to a mirror shine, yet there was no warmth to be found. No children played on the designer rugs, no guests laughed over dinner, and no music ever drifted through the vents. It was a tomb built of gold and ivory. Arthur lived there like a ghost in his own life. He was a man who had spent 40 years climbing the corporate ladder, only to find that the top was a very lonely place. He had a collection of vintage wines he never shared and a library of books he never read. His only constant companion was the digital glow of his stock tickers and the distant hum of the city's traffic. Midnight watched Arthur through the glass every night. He saw the way Arthur would sometimes hold an old photograph for a long time before putting it face down on the table. The cat sensed a heavy, grey energy radiating from the man, a type of sadness that smelled like dust and old paper. To the world, Arthur was a success, but to the cat, he was fading away. The cat felt a strange pull toward this cold apartment. Perhaps it was because they were both outsiders, one by choice, one by circumstance. Midnight would sit on the narrow ledge outside 1402 for hours, his black fur blending into the night, his golden eyes fixed on the man inside. He was the only witness to Arthur's existence, the only thing in the world that truly looked at him. The change began at 2:14 a.m. It started not with a sound, but with a scent that shifted the very air around the 14th floor. It was a sharp, chemical tang, the smell of ozone and melting plastic. Inside the wall behind the designer kitchen, a frayed wire, ignored for years, finally surrendered to the pressure of its own heat. A single spark jumped from the wire, landing on a pile of decorative dried flowers on the counter. It was a tiny, orange eye that blinked once, then twice, before finding its first meal. The flowers flared up instantly, a small crown of fire that began to lick at the underside of the mahogany cabinets. The fire was quiet, almost polite, as it began its slow march across the kitchen. Midnight's ears swiveled instantly. While humans are dull to the early signs of disaster, a cat's senses are tuned to the frequency of survival. He smelled the ionize, the electric charge that precedes a blaze. He stood up on the ledge, his back arching as the vibration of the flickering wire traveled through the building's skeleton and into his pores. Inside, Arthur was deep in a sleep brought on by exhaustion and a glass of scotch. He didn't hear the soft crackle of the wood. He didn't smell the toxic breath of the melting insulation. He was trapped in a dream of his past, unaware that his present was about to be reduced to ash and smoke. The smart sensors, designed to be the building's brain, had been silenced by a faulty circuit board, leaving the apartment defenseless. By 2:30 a.m., the fire had found the heavy velvet curtains. What had been a small flame was now a roaring orange mouth, devouring the fabric and spitting out clouds of thick, oily black smoke. The smoke didn't rise and vanish, it pooled against the high ceiling, forming a suffocating layer that began to descend like a falling shroud. The air in apartment 1402 became a graveyard of oxygen. The smoke was heavy with the toxins of burning foam and treated wood, a smoke ghost that moved silently through the hallways. It crept into the bedroom, curling around the bedposts and drifting toward Arthur's face. Every breath he took was now a gamble, his lungs filling with the grey poison of his own belongings. Outside on the ledge, Midnight was frantic. He could see the orange glow reflecting off the glass, turning the window into a mirror of hell. The heat was beginning to radiate through the pane, warming his pores to an uncomfortable degree. He began to pace the ledge, his notched ear twitching as he looked for a way into the cage of fire. He let out a long, haunting yowl, a sound that should have woken the dead. But the wind at this height was a howling beast of its own, tearing the sound away and scattering it into the city's abyss. The cat realized that no one was coming. The security guards were floors away, and the neighbors were sound asleep behind fireproof walls. It was just him, the man, and the fire. Paw prints the glass barrier. Midnight pressed his face against the glass, his golden eyes wide with an urgency that transcended his species. Between him and the dying man was 2 inches of reinforced, soundproof glass, a barrier meant to keep the world out, but now it was keeping death in. He scratched at the pane, his claws making a horrific screeching sound, but it wasn't enough to break the silence inside. He looked down at the street below. The cars looked like tiny toys, and the pavement was a 100-foot drop of lethal concrete. One slip, one gust of wind, and he would be nothing but a memory on the sidewalk. But the cat didn't look away from the fire. He saw Arthur's hand twitch on the bed, a final, reflexive movement of a body running out of air. The heat was now unbearable. The glass began to groan under the temperature difference between the freezing night and the furnace within. Midnight noticed a small ventilation window at the very top of the frame, a tiny horizontal slit left open just an inch to allow for fresh air. It was a gap no human could use, and even for a cat, it was a death trap. He didn't hesitate. With a grace that defied the wind, Midnight leaped from his standing position, his claws catching the metal edge of the vent. He hung there for a heartbeat, suspended over the abyss, before he began to work his body into the gap. His fur caught on the jagged latch, and he felt the pressure on his ribs as he squeezed through a space that seemed impossibly small. Hammer Chapter 6, The Desperate Leap. With a final, painful shove, Midnight burst through the vent and dropped into the apartment. He didn't land on a soft rug, he landed in a world of soot and searing heat. The floor was hot enough to burn his pads, and the air was a thick, black soup that stung his eyes and scorched his throat. He was no longer a shadow, he was a black spark in a furnace. The living room was a wall of flame. The expensive art was bubbling, and the grey furniture was now a skeletal remains of orange embers. Midnight stayed low to the ground, where the air was slightly thinner, but even there, the heat was a physical weight. He coughed, a small, wet sound, as the soot began to coat his lungs. He looked toward the bedroom. The path was a gauntlet of falling debris and melting plastic. A piece of the ceiling collapsed just inches from his tail, sending a spray of sparks into his fur. He didn't retreat. He moved with a focused, lethal intent, his notched ear flattened against his head as he dodged the fire's reach. He reached the bed. Arthur was no longer twitching. He lay perfectly still, his skin a pale, sickly grey in the firelight. The smoke was so thick now that the man was almost invisible, a ghost already half transitioned to the other side. Midnight leaped onto the mattress, his weight causing the man's body to shift slightly, but there was no sign of life. "Help," he wheezed, but the fire only answered with a louder roar. He felt a brush of fur against his ankle. Midnight was there, staying low, his tail twitching like a guide's flag. The cat let out a sharp, rhythmic cry, a beacon in the darkness. He moved a few feet toward the hallway and stopped, waiting for the man to follow. Arthur crawled. He stayed on his hands and knees, following the sound of the cat's cry. Every few seconds, Midnight would look back, his eyes catching the light of the flames, guiding the man away from the spots where the floor was collapsing. They moved through the hallway as the ceiling began to melt, dropping liquid plastic like black rain. The heat was a physical barrier, a wall of energy that tried to push them back. Arthur's hands were blistered, and his lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. But every time he thought about giving up, the cat would let out a fierce, demanding yowl. Midnight was the only thing keeping Arthur tethered to the world of the living, a black shadow leading a broken man through hell. Open door, the final exit. They reached the living room, which was now a landscape of ruins. The front door was only 20 feet away, but it was blocked by a fallen beam that was fully engulfed in flames. Arthur looked at the exit and felt a wave of despair. He couldn't jump, and he didn't have the strength to climb. Midnight didn't hesitate. He lunged at the beam, his paws hitting the burning wood as he scrambled over it to the other side. He turned back and began to scratch at the base of the door, his claws making a frantic metallic sound. He was showing Arthur the way, telling him that life was just on the other side of that wooden barrier. Arthur gathered his last bit of strength. He used a fallen chair to lever himself over the burning beam, the heat searing his skin. He reached the door, his fingers fumbling with the heavy brass handle. It was hot, so hot it hissed against his palm, but he turned it with a scream of agony. The door swung open, and the pressurized air of the hallway rushed in. He tumbled out into the corridor, gasping for the filtered air of the building's emergency system. Behind him, the apartment let out a final, thunderous roar as the windows blew outward from the pressure change. Arthur lay on the hallway carpet, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on the open doorway of his ruined life. He looked for the cat. New moon symbol, the vanishing hero. The building was now alive with the sound of sirens and shouting. Firefighters in heavy gear swarmed the 14th floor, their bright flashlights cutting through the lingering smoke. They found Arthur and immediately began to work on him, strapping an oxygen mask to his face and covering his burns with cool gel. There was a cat, Arthur whispered through the mask, his voice a ghost of itself. A black cat, he saved me. The paramedics looked at each other, then at the charred remains of apartment 1402. Nothing could have survived in there, sir, one of them said gently. You're lucky to be alive. It's a miracle you woke up at all. Arthur looked toward the open window at the end of the hallway. In the early morning light, he saw a single set of small, soot-covered paw prints on the white windowsill. They led to the ledge, and then they vanished into the grey fog of the city. There was no body, no sound, and no sign of the creature that had bitten him back to life. Arthur lost everything that night, his art, his wine, his ivory tower. But as he was wheeled into the ambulance, he looked up at the skyscrapers and smiled for the first time in years. He realized that he wasn't alone in the city anymore. Somewhere out there, a shadow with a notched ear was watching the world, and Arthur knew that he had been given a second chance by a hero who didn't want a thank you, just a life to be lived. Final line. Arthur lost his home that night. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't alone. Because sometimes, a hero doesn't wear a cape, he wears fur and a notched ear. If this story gave you chills, smash that like button. Subscribe for the most thrilling and emotional stories. We bring the legends to life. Comment 9 lives below if you believe cats are protectors. And tell us, which city are you watching from? I'm looking for my top fans today.